I used to think the coldest place on Earth was the bottom of the Pacific, but that was before I walked into Department 12 of the Los Angeles Superior Court and saw my mother's smile. It wasn't the smile of a parent relieved to see their child. It was the predatory glint of a shark that had finally cornered its prey. My parents sat there, draped in designer wool and unearned confidence, looking like they were waiting for a coronation rather than a trial. To the world, Charles and Victoria Whitmore were the golden couple of lifestyle television, symbols of grace, success, and the kind of beauty that never seems to age. To me, they were the people who had traded my soul for a first-class ticket to a life that didn't include a 5-year-old daughter. Have you ever felt the air leave a room just because someone looked at you? That's what happened when our eyes met. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a $1.6 billion obstacle. The courtroom was a cathedral of mahogany and hushed whispers, the kind of place where legacies are either cemented or shredded. My pulse was a frantic hammer against my ribs, an internal rhythm of terror that seemed loud enough to disturb the court reporter. Then, the judge entered. Judge Marcus Nolan. He was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of granite, his eyes scanning the room with a terrifying level of discernment. When his gaze finally landed on me, something strange happened. The air didn't just still, it froze. A flicker of something, was it shock? Recognition? Passed over his face. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a register that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Wait," he whispered, the microphone catching the tremor in his breath. "You're her? You're Henry's Emma?" The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. My parents' polished masks didn't just slip, they fractured. In that heartbeat, the lies they'd spent 2 decades perfecting began to bleed through the cracks. But to understand why a sitting judge would look at me with such haunted reverence, you have to understand the afternoon the world ended. I was 5 years old when the sun tried to burn the memory of my parents into the Santa Barbara pavement. It was a Tuesday, I think. The heat was a physical weight, the kind that makes the horizon shimmer like a fever dream. My mother, Victoria, was a vision in white silk, her lilac perfume so thick it felt like I was breathing in a funeral arrangement. She knelt in front of me, her movements practiced and fluid. "Be a brave little bird for Grandpa, okay, sweetheart," she said. Her smile was a masterpiece of deception, bright and hollow, never quite reaching her eyes, which were already scanning the driveway for the car. "Where are you going?" I asked, my small hand fist-tight around the fabric of her dress. "Can I come? I'll be quiet. I promise." She didn't answer. She couldn't. My father, Charles, was already by the silver convertible, his fingers drumming a restless, impatient beat on the hood. "Vic, let's go. The flight won't wait, and neither will the producers." He didn't even look at me. To him, I was just another piece of luggage they'd decided was over the weight limit. Victoria leaned in, and for a second I thought I'd get a hug, a real one, the kind that keeps the monsters away. Instead, she kissed the air an inch from my cheek, her diamond earrings cold against my skin. Then she was gone. The car door slammed with a sound like a gunshot. Tires spat gravel against my shins, and the silver blur vanished behind the iron gates of the Whitmore estate. I ran. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, until the dust turned my socks gray, calling names that the wind just blew back into my mouth. I collapsed at the edge of the drive, the smell of gasoline and expensive leather still hanging in the stagnant air. That was the moment I learned that love isn't a right. It's a luxury that some people can't afford to keep. Then a shadow fell over me. It wasn't the cold shadow of a predator, but the warm, steady shade of an oak tree. Grandpa Henry knelt in the dirt beside me, ignoring the crease in his tailored trousers. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell me they'd be back soon. He simply brushed the grit from my knees with a hand that had built empires but felt as soft as velvet. "They don't know the value of what they've thrown away, Emma," he murmured, his voice a low rumble of sorrow and iron. He took my chin in his hand, forcing me to look into eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and decided to be kind anyway. "Look at me. You will never be unwanted again. Do you hear me? Not as long as there is breath in my body." He lifted me up, and for the first time that day, the world stopped shaking. As he carried me toward the great stone house, my head resting on his shoulder, I could hear the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart. It was a promise. If you've ever lost everything in a single afternoon, you know that safety isn't a place. It's a person. But what happens when that person is the only thing standing between you and the wolves who share your DNA? Growing up as the shadow of Henry Whitmore was an education in the soul. My grandfather wasn't just a billionaire, he was the architect of Whitmore Industries, a global titan of logistics that basically kept the world's heart beating. But at home, he was just the man who made cocoa at 2 a.m. because he knew I was having nightmares about silver convertibles. Emma, he'd say, sliding a mug with exactly 4 marshmallows across the kitchen island. The world is going to try to tell you who you are based on how much you have or who your parents were. Don't listen. A person's worth isn't found in a bank statement. It's found in the things they refuse to sell. He taught me how to read the world. Every morning at dawn, we'd sit in his study, the smell of old paper and sea salt filling the air. He'd hand me a business contract or a newspaper clipping and tell me to find the lie. Truth, he'd whisper, is a shy creature. It hides under the big words and the loud promises. You have to be quiet enough to hear it. I watched him move through the world like a king who preferred the company of the peasants. He'd spend hours at the community centers he built, kneeling in the dirt with kids who had nothing, teaching them that their minds were the only territory no one could ever conquer. Meanwhile, on the television in the den, I'd see my parents. They had a hit reality show now, The Whitmore Way, where they preached about family values and redemption while I was a ghost in their history. I'd watch them cry on camera about the tragedy of their busy lives keeping them from their daughter, and I'd feel a cold, sharp anger crystallize in my chest. "Do you hate them?" Grandpa asked me one evening when I was 16, his eyes reflecting the flickering blue light of the TV. "I don't feel enough for them to hate them," I lied. He nodded slowly. "Good. Hate is just a different way of being obsessed. It's a chain that keeps you locked to the person who hurt you. Stay free, Emma. Freedom is the only thing worth more than the Whitmore name." On my 16th birthday, he didn't give me a car or a diamond. He gave me a small, worn journal bound in brown leather. "For your truth," he said, "because one day, the world will try to rewrite your story. This book will be your witness." I didn't know then that he was giving me a weapon. The day Grandpa Henry died, the ocean went silent. I found him in his study, the golden afternoon light spilling over his desk like spilled honey. He looked like he was just sleeping, his glasses resting on a page of figures, his hand still holding a pen. The final line he'd written was, "Truth in the wrong hands turns to poison." The grief didn't hit me all at once. It was a slow, agonizing drowning. He was my wall, my shield, my father, and my compass. And now I was standing on the cliffs of Santa Barbara, looking at a horizon that suddenly felt too big to navigate alone. The funeral was a spectacle I knew he would have hated. The elite descended like vultures in mourning clothes, senators, CEOs, and socialites all jockeying for a position near the casket, hoping some of Henry's integrity might rub off on them by proximity. And then I saw the silver lining of the cloud I'd been fearing for 20 years. My parents. They moved through the crowd like royalty, Victoria dabbing at dry eyes with a $400 handkerchief, Charles looking solemn and practiced. When they approached me, the air felt like it was curdling. "Emma, darling," Victoria said, reaching out a gloved hand. "You've grown into such a substantial young woman." "You've grown into a stranger," I replied, my voice as flat as the sea. Charles cleared his throat, his eyes darting around to see if any cameras were watching. "This is a difficult time for everyone. We should be together, as a family." "Family?" The word felt like a shard of glass in my mouth. "You left me here like a piece of unwanted furniture. You didn't call. You didn't write. You only exist in pixels and press releases. You always were prone to drama," Charles snapped, his veneer of grief cracking for a split second to reveal the cold irritation underneath. We didn't have time for more. Mr. Briggs, Grandpa's longtime attorney, beckoned us toward the estate office. The reading of the will was a formality most of the crowd expected to be a simple handoff to the next generation of Whitmores. The room was packed, the tension so thick you could taste the metallic tang of it. Samuel Briggs didn't look at my parents. He looked at me. "The late Henry Whitmore," he began, his voice echoing in the vaulted room, "leaves the entirety of his estate, including Whitmore Industries, all real estate holdings, and liquid assets totaling $1.6 billion to his granddaughter, Emma Whitmore." The sound that left my mother's throat was something between a gasp and a scream. Charles stood up so fast his chair hit the floor with a thundering crack. "That's impossible. He was senile. He was manipulated." "There is a message included for you both," Samuel continued, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. It reads, "Those who abandon truth for comfort have already surrendered their inheritance. I already gave you the only thing that mattered, a chance to be decent. You chose to waste it." Victoria's face went white, then a mottled, ugly red. "He can't do this. We're his blood." "And Emma was his heart," Samuel replied. I sat there frozen, feeling the weight of the empire Grandpa had placed on my shoulders. I wasn't just a girl anymore, I was a target. Do you think money solves problems, or does it just give them a bigger stage to play on? If you're finding this story as intense as I lived it, maybe it's time to ask yourself, what would you do if your own parents declared war on you for a paycheck? The attack came exactly 7 days later, a thick, white envelope on my doorstep that felt like it was filled with lead. Notice of civil action. Charles and Victoria Whitmore versus Emma Whitmore. The charge? Undue influence. They were claiming I had poisoned Grandpa's mind, that I had isolated him, medicated him, and coerced him into signing that will. The media frenzy was a nightmare. Within 24 hours, my face was on every tabloid. The billion-dollar brat, they called me. The girl who stole a fortune. My parents went on every talk show that would have them, weeping about how their troubled daughter had locked them out of Henry's final days. Emma, they're playing for keeps, my lawyer, Robert Hayes, told me in his office. This isn't just about the money. They want to destroy your reputation so the court has no choice but to invalidate the will. They're going to dig into every corner of your life. Let them dig, I said, my voice shaking. They'll only find the holes they left behind. The weeks leading up to the trial were a blur of depositions and late-night strategy sessions. I felt like I was being watched every time I stepped outside. Paparazzi camped at the gates, shouting questions about my greed and my viciousness. I stayed inside the mansion, wandering the rooms Grandpa had filled with life, feeling the walls start to close in. One night, I sat in his study, the leather journal in my lap. I was terrified. What if they won? What if the world believed their polished lies over my jagged truth? I opened the book to a random page. When truth is tested, stand still, Grandpa had written. Let them strike. They'll only hurt themselves against the reality of what they are. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the room, tobacco, old leather, and a hint of the sea. I wasn't a girl being sued by her parents. I was a Whitmore, and it was time to act like one. Which brings us back to that courtroom, back to Judge Nolan and the moment the world stopped spinning. Proceed, Judge Nolan said, his voice now carrying a sharp edge of authority that made the spectators sit up straighter. My parents' lawyer, a man named Elliot Graves who looked like he'd been polished with a high-grit sandpaper, stood up. Your Honor, we will show a pattern of manipulation. We will show that Emma Whitmore created a fortress around Henry, cutting off his only son and daughter-in-law to secure a payout that she did nothing to earn. Composure isn't guilt, Mr. Graves, I said, my voice ringing out before Robert could stop me. It's faith in the truth. The gallery erupted in a low murmur. Judge Nolan's mouth didn't move, but his eyes sparkled. The trial was a bloodbath. My parents' team brought in experts who analyzed Henry's signatures, claiming they showed signs of mental fatigue. They brought in a former maid we'd fired for theft, who claimed I'd shouted at Grandpa and told him his son hated him. Each lie felt like a physical blow, a bruise on the memory of the man I loved. Then, Victoria took the stand. She was a masterclass in performative grief. We tried to see him, she sobbed into her lace handkerchief. But Emma, she told us he didn't want us there. She told us he'd forgotten who we were. We just wanted to hold his hand one last time. I looked at her and didn't see a mother. I saw a hollow vessel, filled with nothing but the need for more. Your witness, Graves said, looking triumphant. Robert stood up. He didn't go for the throat immediately. He was a surgeon, not a butcher. Mrs. Whitmore, you say you tried to visit. Can you provide the dates? Oh, it was so many. I can't remember exactly. We have the gate logs for the last 5 years, Robert said, his voice dropping into a deadly calm. Your name appears exactly twice. Once for a Christmas party Henry threw for his staff, and once when you came to ask for a loan for your production company. Is that correct? Victoria's sob hitched. The logs must be incomplete. And these emails, Robert continued, a new folder appearing on the screen. Sent from your private account to Henry's office. They don't mention your love for him. They mention your brand and your need for capital. In fact, in this one, you refer to your daughter as the live-in help. A collective gasp went through the room. Victoria's face transformed. The grief vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp-featured rage. He owed us. He built that empire for his family. He built it for the people who earned it, Robert said. No further questions. But the real ending hadn't even started. On the third day, it was my turn. I walked to the stand, the leather journal tucked under my arm like a shield. I could feel my parents' glares like heat on the side of my face. Miss Whitmore, Graves said, pacing in front of me, you claim your grandfather was of sound mind. Yet he left a billion-dollar company to a girl who has never run anything more complicated than a bathtub. Isn't it true you played on his loneliness? That you made yourself his only friend so he'd have no one else to leave it to? I didn't make myself his friend, I said, looking Graves directly in the eye. I was his family, something the people sitting behind you wouldn't understand. He didn't leave me the company as a reward. He left it to me because he knew I was the only one who wouldn't sell his soul for a higher share price. Emotional theatrics, Graves shouted. This court needs facts. Then let's give them facts, I said. I opened the journal. Your Honor, Robert interrupted, we submit the personal diaries of Judge Henry Whitmore, written in his own hand, every night for the last 20 years. The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. My mother half rose from her seat, her eyes wide with terror. She knew Grandpa kept a record of everything. I turned to the final entry, dated 3 days before he passed. My voice was steady, but my heart was screaming. My son and his wife live for appearances, I read. They are ghosts in a world of mirrors. My granddaughter Emma lives for truth. She is the only thing in this life that I truly built that didn't have a price tag. The estate must belong to her, not as a gift, but as a fortress. She carries my conscience now. I can finally rest knowing the Whitmore name actually means something again. I looked up from the book. He wasn't lonely, Mr. Graves. He was observant. He saw exactly who they were. And he saw who I was. He didn't give me his money. He gave me his trust. Judge Nolan leaned forward, his face etched with a profound, somber respect. Is that the journal Henry mentioned to me? He asked softly. Yes, Your Honor, I whispered. The verdict wasn't a surprise. It was an execution. Judge Nolan didn't even retire to his chambers for long. When he returned, his voice carried the weight of a final judgment. This court finds no evidence of undue influence, he stated, his gaze raking over my parents with visible disdain. What I see instead is a desperate attempt by 2 people to steal a legacy they spent a lifetime discarding. Justice does not belong to blood. It belongs to truth. The will stands. The case is dismissed. The gavel hit the wood with a sound that felt like it echoed all the way back to that dusty driveway in Santa Barbara. It was over. I walked out of that courtroom into a wall of camera flashes, but I didn't hide. I didn't run. I stood on the steps, the wind whipping my hair, and felt the sun on my face for the first time in weeks. Emma, how does it feel to be the richest woman in California? A reporter screamed. I paused, looking at the lens of the nearest camera. It doesn't feel like being rich, I said quietly. It feels like being seen. That night, I sat in the study, the house finally quiet. The vultures were gone. The lawyers were gone. It was just me and the portraits. My phone buzzed on the desk, a blocked number. I answered it. Emma? It was my father, but it wasn't the voice of the man who had sued me. It was a voice I hadn't heard since I was 4 years old. Small, broken, and terrified. I read it, he whispered. The news, the quotes from the journal. He really thought that about me? That I was a ghost? He didn't think it, Dad. He knew it. There was a long, shaky exhale on the other end of the line. I think I lost myself a long time ago. I thought if I had the money, I'd be real again. But seeing you in that courtroom, you looked like him. You looked like you actually knew who you were. I do, I said. I'm sorry, he said. And for the first time in my life, I believed him. I don't expect you to forgive us. I wanted you to know that he was right. You're the only thing he built that matters. When the line went dead, I didn't cry. I walked out to the garden, the smell of roses and salt spray filling the night air. The ocean was a vast, dark mirror under the moon. I realized then that the $1.6 billion wasn't the inheritance. The mansion wasn't the inheritance. The inheritance was the ability to stand in the dark and not be afraid of what was looking back. Loneliness makes dangerous choices feel reasonable. Desire whispers louder than guilt. I stood at the edge of the cliff, the journal tight against my chest. The truth had reached back, just like Grandpa said it would, and for the first time in 20 years, the wind didn't feel like it was blowing me away. It felt like it was holding me up. I'm Emma Whitmore, and I am finally, truly home. If you've ever felt like the unwanted one in your own story, just remember, a diamond is just a piece of charcoal that handled stress exceptionally well. Subscribe if you're ready to start building your own empire, one truth at a time.